Let's talk further about the freedom foreknowledge problem. Before we talk further about that, let's remind ourselves a little bit about what the central freedom foreknowledge problem is. We saw first a fallacy, a scope fallacy in the formulation of the problem. We saw that in Augustine, we saw it in Maimonides. That leads us to look for a more sophisticated presentation of the problem. For that, we found an argument that appeals to the necessity of the past and looks very much structurally like an argument for logical fatalism. That leads us to wonder, is there any difference between theological and logical fatalism? If you're committed to one, are you committed to the other? How do we distinguish the two? Regarding that question, we turned to the work of William of Ockham. Ockham distinguished between hard and soft facts about the past. We can use that distinction to explain why we might want to reject the argument for logical fatalism. And defenders of theological fatalism can also use that distinction to try to say there's a difference between claims that are apparently about the past, that are of a purely logical structure, and claims about what God believed in the past, which are different in kind, since beliefs by their very nature are things that can be completely over and done with once you have the belief. So what you believed when you were 3 years old, even if it's about the year 2029, doesn't matter. It's not really about the future. It's apparently about the future, but it's really about the past. And so the fact that is expressed by talking about what you believed when you were 3 years old, whatever the content of the belief is, it doesn't matter. The belief is over and done with. It is fully about the past, and so ought to get counted as a hard fact about the past. That's John Martin Fisher's take on the argument for incompatibilism. We now have moved past identifying theological determinism with logical determinism, focusing instead on the nature of belief and God's beliefs, and trying to understand whether and how it might be possible for God to know in advance, even though it doesn't compel, constrain, rob us of our autonomy. That's the compatibilist challenge. Can you find a way to reconcile these two? So on the incompatibilist side, there are two positions. There's the position that emphasizes the providence and foreknowledge of God, valuing that above autonomy, insisting that whatever we give up, we have to give up something about human freedom if it conflicts with divine sovereignty, providence, and complete foreknowledge. Call that the Thomist position, because it's a position I'm pretty sure that Aquinas held. On the other side is a relatively new position, a position that says human freedom is more important than full and complete providential control of the future. If there's a conflict, we retain autonomy, we retain freedom, especially a libertarian conception of freedom. And we restrict what we say about God's foreknowledge regarding the future. These are called open theists. The term open theism was introduced in Richard Rice's book, The Openness of God, which was published in 1980. Open theists claim that there are many precursors in the history of Christian thought and theology in general to the view that they have named open theism. Open theism is a position that's been endorsed by many people in the 20th century. I identified the view most closely with Richard Rice Clark Pinnock, Greg Boyd, John Sanders, and William Hasker. There have been a number of important philosophers of religion since the 1980s who have endorsed the view as well. So, for example, in addition to Bill Hasker, you can find a view like this in Richard Swinburne. You can find it in Peter Van Inwagen. Dean Zimmerman has endorsed it. Tim O'Connor has endorsed it. Keith DeRose, Richard Creel, Robin Collins. A whole bunch of philosophers have endorsed it, which is a bit surprising since it's a relative newcomer in one sense to theological discussion. Now, of course, attempts to establish historical precedents for the view are important here. And if you grew up in a church like I did, this is the sort of thing that relative newcomers to the theological scene tend to do. I grew up in a Pentecostal community, and it was standard fare in discussions to try to tie Pentecostal phenomena to the history of Pentecostalism, to the history of the church in general, claiming this is not a new thing. This is just a reviving of something that's been there all along. Just so with open theism, because in conservative circles, theological innovation is frowned on, not the sort of thing that anybody wants to be guilty of. In non-conservative areas, maybe innovation is highly prized. In general, our culture values originality, and just so in non-conservative theology. Innovation, creativity, originality, people go after that. You can actually get stuff published when you have new things to say. What is central to open theism is the idea that God is responsive in some ways, that God is open with respect to the future, that he hasn't predetermined everything that's going to happen, but has shared that responsibility with the created order, allowing human beings to contribute as well, and perhaps other animals, perhaps other things in the universe. It depends on how far you think freedom can be found in the created order. The standard view is you find it in human beings, and it's often thought that there are other animals. Mentation may be central to freedom, so maybe you find freedom expressed by animals other than human beings as well. Perhaps even further down the evolutionary ladder. Who knows how far freedom extends? Some philosophers have even posited that you can find freedom all the way down to the subatomic level. In any case, what is the responsiveness or openness of God? Well, when you read sacred scriptures of either Jewish, Muslim, or Christian sources, you find God responding to human activity. You see things like, oh my goodness, look at what these people have become. I think I'm going to wipe them out and start over. Or, in a rather astonishing passage about Sodom and Gomorrah, God says, let's go down and see what these people are up to. One can argue that such presentations simply take the point of view of human beings on the activity of God. But the narrative presents God as being responsive, coming to the Garden of Eden and asking, where are you? As if God didn't already know. Looking at what happens in history and telling Moses, I think I'm going to wipe out these people and give you a different people. And then changing in attitude once Moses objects. In any case, once you start looking at these passages, it's a natural view to think, maybe God is responsive, maybe God is open to the future. maybe foreknowledge, providence, and sovereignty should be understood in more limited ways so that you don't have to have complete and total foreknowledge of the future in order to be omniscient, in order to be providential, in order to have complete sovereignty over everything that occurs. It's obvious open theists accept the argument and just say, so that means one of the premises is false. Which premise is that? It's the premise that says, if you're going to do something freely tomorrow, then God has always believed in the past that you're going to do that thing tomorrow. For an open theist, that's just not true. The most we could find in terms of divine attitudes about what the future is going to be like are probability judgments. God could know in advance that the probability of your getting up at 9 a.m. was pretty high. But God wouldn't believe, because he couldn't know, that you will in fact get up at 9 a.m., even though that might be the case. Suppose it is the case. That's something that God wouldn't have a belief about and couldn't know until the event happens, and then he does know. So, open theists reject the claim that if P will be true tomorrow, God has always believed that P will be true tomorrow.